to another episode of the Andrew Glowczewski Experience. This is going to be episode 185, and we are going to continue just working on this one here. Don't know if I'm going to be doing more. Like, I probably have time to do more, but, you know. I missed a day yesterday. I got caught watching Loki, and dummy me, I started all the way from the beginning so I could watch the three first chapters, and I could watch chapter three with fresh, or episode three with episodes one and two fresh on my mind. Didn't need to do that, but it took up my time, and then I lost time to stream. So yeah, we're just gonna pick up with this one, and that's it. Yo, so I rewatched these videos from Sleep Easy on YouTube, uh, and recently in like the last couple of episodes or something, and I went back to his channel and I see he has like a bunch of videos now because Intermission or Intergrade, whatever that thing is called, the remake released the Yuffie stuff, and now he has like a whole bunch of other videos on that, and I was so excited to play them, and holy shit, this guy, I love this guy's videos, man. He deep dives, he goes into the shit, he explains the lore, and he goes way further than I'd ever imagine anybody going. And he talked about things that I didn't even see, so because I be drawing while I work on this, or so yeah, he talked about some stuff, and I was like, I didn't even know that was in the game. So like, clearly, I'm not watching these things enough. So I'll probably have to go back and rewatch some people's playthroughs or something. Either way, I mean, he makes all this shit sound so dope, especially since he goes into the other games, and not even just like Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core or anything like that, but even like other games like every game, all the obscure shit, even like the side content or the multiplayer versions, like he goes into everything. So either way, I'm watching this one video. It's like 3 hours long, and I'm already a little bit into it. And it's called Genesis is Back. And then he's just breaking down the entire story of the intergrade stuff. So I don't know, man. I love this shit. This is the type of shit that I love. So I'm gonna have that playing in the background while I just continue working on this one. Since it's already shaded, rendered, and all that stuff, I'm just gonna jump into coloring it. And who knows? It might be a quick video, it might be a long one. Oh yeah, and I also went and bought new markers because I've been talking about how my light colors are starting to go. So I marked these ones because these are the ones I want to use first since they're running low on ink, or they seem to be drying up more or less. And they're all my light colors. So I went and I just bought a gang of these. Um, so hopefully my light colors can have the same longevity as my darker markers that I don't need to use as much because, well, they're dark, so I don't need to like layer it as much. So yeah, let's just do this.
As this sort of sets a mentality that Wu Tai itself, without the assistance of others, must regain its honor. And what about her experiences with both Shinra and the Turks? As Yuffie has had plenty of interactions with Zack and the playable Turk, it'll be interesting to see how the story moves forward with these prior experiences in regards to the larger events in Remake. She has had one other interaction with someone tied to Shinra that is far more compelling, but we will get to that in a moment. Sometime between the year 3, in which she departs from Mutai, and the beginning of Remake, Yuffie finds herself a part of the special force operations of the new Mutai government. I now want to briefly discuss some of the newer developments that come directly into play during Yuffie's introduction in Intermission. Just know that while this is new lore being introduced by Intermission, there are firmly established connections to this new lore in the compilation, and for that reason, we need to go over them now. The state of Wutai in Intermission. During her introduction, Yuffie mentions that she is a Special Forces member of the new Wutai government. While you may want to think that this is just some Yuffie shenanigans going on here, like her self-proclaimed title materia hunter, it is important to note that the mission assignment is given to Yuffie directly through the Wutai government. This info is provided in Yuffie's bio from Intergrade. She is currently working to save her hometown after it has lost its luster as a result of the war with Shinra. Yuffie is assigned a secret mission from the new Wutai government and is sent to infiltrate Midgard. The other important note from Yuffie's bio is the mention of Wutai losing its luster. This leads me to believe that we're going to see a very similar Wutai to the one in OG, a sad tourist trap as Yuffie describes it. But taking into
Damn.
account the events of the compilation and this activity we're seeing in Remake, Wutai has been secretly fighting against Shinra. But it is important to note that this particular partnership between Wutai and Avalanche seems to be spurred on by the call to arms from Avalanche, and not the other way around. One character's bio states that Avalanche is attempting to strengthen its relationship with Wutai, and for this reason is assisting Wutai in its efforts to get the ultimate materia from Shinra. This relationship Avalanche is establishing with Wutai is way more important than you know, as it will give us the full scope of how interconnected each party is to each other. But before we can do that, you need to understand why the materia is so important to Wutai. While Yuffie is the known materia thief, she shares this same fascination for materia with her father. This is exemplified at the end of Yuffie's side mission in the OG, in which she confronts her father in Wutai on her own and defeats him, in which Goto tells Yuffie to continue with the group to restore Wutai honor. But as the group leaves, Goto pulls Yuffie aside to tell her to make sure that after the journey with Cloud and the party is complete, that she give all of their materia, to which Yuffie laughs and assures Goto that she will. So when looking at what Biggs says later in Remake about Avalanche promising all of the materia in Midgard for Wutai's assistance, this becomes pretty convincing that Avalanche is not trying to appeal to Yuffie for her assistance, but rather Goto himself. For those who aren't aware of this, the obsession with materia that Goto and Yuffie share is actually quite important to understanding the mentality of these two characters, as the purpose for the materia is to use against Shinra. This explains a lot of Wutai's involvement in Intergrade when looking at Goto's reasoning for why he gave up trying to fight Shinra in the Wutai War in the original game. Strength without determination means nothing, and determination without strength is equally useless. So, as history describes it, the end of the Wutai War was pushed in favor of Shinra, and this was because of the appearance of Shinra's soldiers. And regardless of how much Goto wanted to keep fighting, his strength did not match that of the strength of Shinra, regardless of his determination. This is the key reason for Goto wanting to gather materia, as well as Yuffie's, to balance the scale. While you may think that this mentality of these two characters is a self-contained event that only takes place in the original game, it is immediately brought up in the beginning of Yuffie's chapter in On the Way to a Smile, a book taking place after the events of Meteorfall. In the Forgotten Capital, Yuffie asks the party for the materia. After some debate, Cloud gives her only materia used for healing purposes. Goto, upon hearing that Yuffie has not brought back the powerful and more importantly dangerous materia, the materia that would be used to defend Wutai and fight Shinra, Goto is not upset. This is because both Yuffie and Goto come to the same conclusion. The only reason in which they would need to use that type of materia is to fight off Shinra, which, as we know at the time of On the Way to a Smile, Shinra is no longer a threat. The last thing I will mention is that the new Wutai government's Special Forces Group members are given the title of Shinobi, which is kind of a nice nod to Yuffie's theme song, Descendants of the Shinobi. Now that we've established Wutai's involvement with Avalanche, we're going to talk about another founder of Avalanche, one that we haven't discussed yet, but has the most presence in Remake than any other member of the original Avalanche, and has a direct tie to Wutai, and that is Rufus. In order to understand Rufus's involvement with Avalanche, we need to once again look at the time frame in which Avalanche was born. During the same month of Avalanche's inception, Rufus has already established himself somehow as one of the essential members, as his first first mention of his involvement comes in formally in Before Crisis during the 6th month of the new year, as he is mentioned as Avalanche's informant. However, there is an earlier time in which Before Crisis establishes Rufus as being an ally to Avalanche, and that is during the 2nd month of the new year, again, the month after Avalanche's inception. This less obvious event comes literally the moment before the attempt on the president's life, during Avalanche's attempt to take over Junon, which, as I have stated earlier, is another event that is established as to have happened in Remake, giving the scene that much more importance. Right before the attempt on the president's life, Rufus calls his father, telling him that he has been watching his father through the Shinra security system, and that the situation isn't looking so hot for him. President Shinra is surprised by Rufus's call, as he mentions that the call is very out of character for his son to do. Rufus disregards the comment and then asks for more information on the new Turk, your playable character, to which he then just leaves. This is kind of important because President Shinra is right. This is extremely out of character for Rufus to do what he is doing, checking in on his father only to follow up to insinuate that his father might be killed. But what Rufus is doing here is actually more in character with the context of his involvement with Avalanche and what his specific talents are. It's worth noting that Rufus is kind of a tech guy. He often is able to gain access to Shinra information, get passcodes, and is able to slip by security systems that even the Turks have issues getting through. Some of this is most likely due to the access given to him through his position in Shinra, him being the vice president. But there are several instances that show him displaying this talent outside of the context of his title. One of the other things mentioned in the dialogue with Rufus is the surveillance system. Rufus spends a considerable amount of time using this system, as it gives him a view to pretty much all Shinra buildings, including reactors. Most likely the same system that we see being used by Mayor Domino, and the same system that Heidegger uses to monitor the reactor bombings. The reason Rufus uses these often is to gather information specifically for his use. Most of the intel he gathers is to accomplish the goal of killing his father. That is Rufus's prime motivation through the entirety of Before Crisis and in Remake, all in order to become the president, and he will do whatever is necessary
Dang,
to
Rufus,
obtain that.
you
The
cold-blooded.
reason I mention this and this event is that this is most likely why Rufus is watching the scene unfold through the security system to begin with, and why he chooses this moment to call his father, as Rufus is not doing so to check up on his father, rather he is doing so for some sort of plan. There is no other motivator for him other than that to do so. He is most likely trying to get an update on the unfolding events for the purpose of giving information to Avalanche. This is also why he is asking specifically about the player Turk, as Avalanche's plan, in turn Rufus's plan, is being thwarted by your character. Again, this call happens literally as Fajito is trying to locate the president. So the level of coincidence, the motivation of Rufus's character, and his goal and involvement with Avalanche's actions make this rather convincing. The main takeaway here is that this establishes that Rufus is an integral part of Avalanche from the very beginning of its formation. And while Elf and Fajito are the face of Avalanche, a lot of what they end up doing is to further Rufus's agenda, his plan, and the plan of Avalanche are one and the same. So, in Before Crisis, from the beginning, Rufus has been one of the key members of Avalanche. Now that we have the full context of Rufus's involvement with Avalanche and Wutai's involvement with Avalanche, I would like to make one more connection, as Rufus is also directly involved with Wutai. Rufus Wutai and Materia. As we know in Intermission, Avalanche HQ wants to strengthen its relationship with Wutai. In order to do so, Avalanche HQ offers them all of the materia in Midgard, to which Avalanche informs Wutai of an ultimate materia in Shinra HQ. From there, Yuffie is sent to Midgard to get it with the help of Avalanche HQ. These events directly mirror an event that has already taken place in the compilation in Crisis Core. Rufus in Crisis Core is noted as being a possible leak to Wutai for both soldier information and emails, but also is noted to gift Godo with information on the location of powerful materia, including summon materia like Bahamut Fury. This excerpt comes from Crisis Core's keyword section in its Ultimania. Blonde-haired man, a man who leaked the email addresses of soldier operatives and information regarding treasures to Godo, Yuffie's father, after the Wutai War. Both Lazard, who held a grudge against Shinra and knew the personal information of soldier operatives, and Rufus, who has close ties to the Avalanche base in Wutai, match this description, but the truth is unclear. While this information seems to be left intentionally obscure, pointing to either Lazard or Rufus, there are some very clear indicators pointing to Rufus being this leak. This becomes abundantly clear when we look into who exactly acquires and uses this information. The person who ends up using this information is Yuffie. After defeating the summoned Bahamut Fury in a side quest in Crisis Core, Yuffie tells Zack how she was able to locate the materia that she has been messaging Zack about. Right after the Wutai War was over, a blonde guy came to visit my dad. He brought all of these mail addresses and treasure scuttlebutt rumors with him. What is this event in Crisis Core a direct reflection of? This same event taking place between Godo and the blonde-haired man who is most likely Rufus is literally the same event that we are seeing with Wutai and Avalanche HQ. In Remake, Avalanche HQ isn't just giving the materia to Wutai, mind you. Avalanche HQ is simply pointing Wutai to the location of this mysterious materia. We have no idea where the rumor for this ultimate materia comes from, as there has yet to be any indication of how Avalanche HQ acquired this information to give to Wutai. This rumor of a powerful materia is the same type of rumor given to Godo by the blonde-haired man. In both instances, from Crisis Core and in Remake, Yuffie takes it upon herself to retrieve it. And in my opinion, in both instances of these events, Rufus is directly involved. I wholeheartedly think that Square is intentionally creating this duality of events in order to signify Rufus's involvement with Avalanche. Not only with Avalanche and Wutai in Crisis Core, but also to set up the context for Rufus's direct involvement with Avalanche HQ in both Remake and in Intergrade. Rufus is being set up to be the person behind all Avalanche's actions in Remake. This next segment will go over exactly how this relationship of Avalanche and Rufus has formed into Remake, as Rufus also has involvement with one other key event with Avalanche's history, the death of Avalanche. Now we're going to move on to another important part of Avalanche's story. In the month right before Remake begins, the world premiere timeline states that the leader of Avalanche is killed. And that, my friends, is the moment in which Zirconiad is summoned in the final events of Before Crisis. This specific wording on the timeline here is a direct reference to Elf from Before Crisis, in which Elf is shot by some as directed to by Rufus. While she is supposedly murdered here, she is later discovered to have survived, and her death actually faked. By the way, when I say the exact wording is used in the timeline, I mean the exact wording used upon Elf's supposed death. and in the document that Rufus himself signs to confirm this at the end of Before Crisis. It is literally the same phrasing. This means that Elf in Remake is in fact alive and still with her father Belle, whose death was also faked in the same shooting. This is proven to us because Belle is seen during the events of Meteorfall at the end of Before Crisis, and also has involvement in the events directly after Meteorfall in On the Way to a Smile, as he actually appears to give intel to the Turks in Calm. So while you may think that Elf and Veld are no longer active parties in Final Fantasy VII's universe, that is not the case. So why is Elf being alive so important? The reason it's important is because of who is responsible for them being alive in the first place. And that is because of Rufus, the finale of Before Crisis. Rufus, in a conversation with his father during the final moments of Before Crisis, talk about the Turks. As Before Crisis' story unravels, the president sees the Turks as more and more of a liability. It gets to the point where the president takes steps to eliminate the Turks. Rufus, being involved with the Turks up until this point, both having opposed them as well as having assisted them, cuts a deal with his father to prove their loyalty to Shinra as a company. The deal is made that the Turks can remain alive for the time being, but only if they carry out the duty of killing both Veld and Elf with their own hands, as Veld and Elf, while being helped by the Turks, have been primary targets of the company for quite some time. Rufus agrees to these terms set by his father, and he then tells Sung to carry out this task. Sung then, in a very over-the-top performance, fakes both of their deaths in front of both Reno, Rude, and several Shinra troops. Sung then makes sure to dispose of their bodies. Later on in the final scene, President Shinra holds a company meeting to decide the fate of the Turks, to which Rufus barges in, exclaiming the Turks' worth. He then uses the death of Veld and Elf as an example of the Turks' loyalty, which President Shinra agrees
Look at them, they
to
killed them, they
continue allowing
Lyle.
them to operate as a group under Shinra. After this meeting, Rufus and the remaining Turks in private go over the meeting, to which Rufus says, "That was quite the performance, Sung." Just to be absolutely clear with you guys, Sung didn't say a fucking thing during the meeting. What Rufus is referring to is how Sung made Elf and Veld's deaths believable enough so that Rufus could use their deaths as a bargaining chip to save the Turks' lives. Sung then thanks Rufus for all that he has done for the Turks, taking into account that Rufus just saved their former leader and mentor, but also saved their lives. Rufus then tells them that they essentially are indebted to him and only work for him, to which Rufus then signs a document knowing that Elf and Veld are alive to confirm that the leader of Avalanche was assassinated. Now, in one foul swoop, Rufus has taken control over the Turks and now is the only remaining leader of Avalanche, leaving absolutely no one to oppose his direction within a completely disjointed Avalanche, and is now the soon-to-be president of the most powerful corporation on the planet. He is now in control of Shinra, Avalanche, and now in Remake is directly tied to Wutai. This man literally has control over all of the major players of any conflict, and you can be sure as hell that we're going to go into how he is involved in Remake with Avalanche. Do you now see why the Zirconiad retcon was such a big deal? If it wasn't for this moment in Before Crisis, we wouldn't have any base to stand on to give any validity to any of this development. This concludes the established history provided by the World Preview timeline and the Before Crisis events, which fully establish Avalanche, Wutai, and the players within them. But from what we know of Remake, this is not the end of Avalanche. Now, we're going to establish right away how Avalanche, as we know it from before Crisis, exists in the unfolding events in Remake. We're going to do this by looking at information provided by the recent Famitsu article on Intermission, as well as title cards within Remake that disclose finer details of Avalanche's function.
Fire
Piece together
details?
what exactly has happened in the time frame between the death of Elf and the start of Remake. Remake defines Avalanche as an organization that has grown to such a large capacity that it, as an entire entity, has begun to split off into separate groups. These groups are created and distinguished by the growing differences in ideologies between the members of Avalanche. And while their different branches are differentiated by these ideologies, they still act towards the goal of destroying Shinra and work together in certain instances. We're going to talk about each of these groups, as some of these differing groups are directly featured in the story of both Remake and Intermission. Avalanche HQ, a group of planetologists working to protect the planet. As the organization grew, smaller cells began to splinter off. To distinguish themselves among the growing factions, it took the appellation HQ. Despite the many groups' different approaches and ideologies, they still occasionally work together for their one shared purpose, the destruction of Shinra. From what we know, this branch, Avalanche HQ, has existed for over a year since the events of Remake. This is because Barrett's team mentions the fact that it had been an entire year since Barrett's group split off from HQ, which means that before Avalanche HQ formed into its own separate branch, it was a part of the original Before Crisis Avalanche. As we know that HQ was formed a year before, in which Avalanche as it existed in Before Crisis was still unified. Something important moving forward is that you might hear other titles for Avalanche HQ like the main Avalanche branch, as the Japanese dialogue for Biggs clarifies that these two names are interchangeable in comparison with the English dialogue. This means that anyone associated with the main branch just know that they are talking about Avalanche HQ. With that cleared up, let's look at two main separations of ideologies when looking at the description for the main Avalanche branch. Main Avalanche branch. A powerful group called Avalanche that is against the actions of Shinra and raises awareness of the planet's life force. Barrett's side of Avalanche uses violent ways to oppose Shinra, such as blowing up the Mako reactors, but the main Avalanche branch is different and wants to protect the lives of the citizens and free them from the grip that Shinra has on them. In order to build ties with the Wutai government, they assist them with the plans to steal the ultimate materia. This definition of Avalanche HQ allows us to clear up what the group of Avalanche's ideologies sit between. That of extreme and destructive actions taken by Barrett's group, which endanger civilian lives through the bombing of the reactors, and Avalanche HQ's ideology to approach situations with more stealth and precise action, which these actions are far less damaging to innocent lives. These approaches create the dynamic in which the entire story of Avalanche unfolds in Remake. This also establishes why Barrett and his branch was rooted from Avalanche HQ to begin with. It is because of these growing differences between Barrett's desire to take action, whereas HQ saw this approach as reckless. These ideologies are also very present in the compilation in Before Crisis, as these ideologies are completely represented in the characters Vegito and Elf, where Elf's actions stem from wanting to create a world without Shinra's influence. She takes only the necessary steps to advance that goal, without trying to cause harm to innocent lives. Vegito, however, is an extremist and wants nothing more than all life to return to the planet in order to replenish the life stream. And because of this mindset, Vegito disregards the value of human life and seeks out any means necessary to further this goal, regardless of the repercussions that it might have on innocent lives. This is where these ideologies stem from, and this divide that we're seeing in Remake is most likely the direct result of this split ideology created in its now absent leader. It's also important to note that there is a mention of another cell in Avalanche in Remake in Chapter 4 with Biggs, the Guard. This group is noted by Biggs in the Japanese dialogue as being either a conservative group or a part of the mainstream group. Avalanche HQ, it's important to mention them as this clarifies the earlier statement made through the quotes that while Avalanche as an entity is split up into separate branches now, these branches do work together to accomplish certain tasks. So just know that while it's unclear exactly who this group belongs to, Old Guard is actively working with Avalanche HQ by the time that remake starts, and that any action taken by them is for the sake of Avalanche HQ's goals, which we will come to know is actually the plan of Rufus Shinra. It's also important to bring up that the Old Guard armor shown in Remake is a direct reference to Avalanche's design from Before Crisis, once again furthering the notion that what Avalanche represents in Before Crisis is being carried over directly into the events of Remake. There is another reference to Before Crisis Avalanche, but we will come to that a little bit later in the video. So with that, we clearly established the parties in which Avalanche as a whole is made up of in Remake. There is Avalanche HQ, which works with the Old Guard branch, and the one we are very clear on already, Barrett's Avalanche. We will now be talking about Avalanche HQ, as most of its function within the story has been very obscure until now. From what we know of the recent announcements, Avalanche HQ consists of several new characters, but they are largely shrouded in mystery. As we know from Remake, Avalanche's story operates in the background, meaning that we never really understood in detail what the larger point of their involvement in Remake meant. We never really knew in detail where they operated from or know anything about the characters that make up this group. And knowing that Yuffie's story in Intermission only consists of 2 chapters, how is Intermission going to develop these Avalanche HQ characters to be functioning aspects of the story, rather than just have them be tacked on? What if I told you that the entire time Remake has been telling us their story, and you just didn't know it? And rather than them only being a part of several moments in Remake, they have actually been an integral part of the entire story, from literally start to end, and are the only reason in which all of the events in Remake take place the way that they do. That while Intermission is showing us these characters for the first time, Remake has already given us everything we need to know about who they are, where they operate from, and their importance to the story, not only in terms of the events of Remake, but how they are important to the development of the main characters in Remake. This section will go over exactly how important these characters have been to the story so far, and how their story ties the loose ends of a Remake story all together. So, the questions are, who are they? Where do they operate from? And what is their impact on the story? While these questions seem to have straightforward answers, they have caused quite a bit of frustration already. Now, Poke, Jujin, and Billy Bob are all new characters introduced in Intermission's trailer, all of them being given their own bios and names through the recent Famitsu article on Intergrade's DLC. There's quite a bit of trouble these characters have caused the larger theorizing community, as most of the community assumed before the Famitsu article came out that these were characters we already heard about in the base game Remake, and that the characters Neo, Poke, and Billy Bob were originally thought of as characters introduced in Barrett's Resolution, a scene that takes place later in Remake, in which Barrett confides in Cloud about the people on his mind that are keeping him up at night, to which he describes 3 Avalanche members: Nellie, the quartermaster of Barrett's branch, and Jesse's close friend; Finn, a lazy kid who won't do anything unless it has to do with painting pictures, and for those who don't know, Finn is credited as the artist for painting the stamp graffiti all over Midgard; and Al, an intel guy mentioned to have ways of getting codes that Barrett says he doesn't understand. He is also talked about as being a ladies' man, someone who used bouquets of flowers to try and woo them. Flowers that Barrett assumes must have come from Eric's garden. These people Barrett regards as friends. These characters, as stated with Finn already had a presence in the base game of Remake. For example, their names are actually featured in the Dart minigame leaderboard in the 7th Heaven bar, meaning that these characters would frequent 7th Heaven. But with the recently released bios for the Avalanche HQ members in Intermission, giving us different names than what we assumed them to be, that was enough convincing evidence that Nellie, Al, and Finn were just not characters depicted in Intergrade's trailer, and because of that, they might not ever appear. To which I respond to that by saying, you are wrong. These characters in Avalanche HQ, Neo,
They are
Hope,
absolutely
and Billy Bob,
there.
are in fact the same ones mentioned by Barrett in his resolution scene. And I am going to prove this to you right now. And to do
Oh
so, we're
shit.
going to take a look at each character's description. Both the descriptions given in the recent Famitsu article and the descriptions given in Barrett's resolution scene. Then we are going to compare them to each other, in which I plan to prove to all of you that these characters are in fact the same in every way. The first one being the one that is the most blatant. Nellie is Neo. Nellie's job in Avalanche HQ, the branch that Barrett claims that she was a part of, was a quartermaster. Her job, by definition, is to distribute goods and oversee branches. Neo's job is disclosed as being the overseer of the branch for Avalanche HQ, to which she watches Barrett's branch intently. Finn is Poke. Finn is a lazy good for nothing. Poke is a lazy good for nothing, spending his time playing the board game for Condor. Finn is said by Barrett to be a kid. Guess what? Poke is also a kid, and is also stated in his bio to be the youngest branch member in Avalanche HQ, to which he is teased and mocked, but he is also treated as a younger brother. This is important to note that the way Barrett talks about the entirety of these characters in the resolution scene is with the same type of bond. Jesse and Nellie being described as sisters, Barrett expressing how good of an artist Finn is by telling Cloud he drew every stamp. This is the same type of relationship reflected in Poke's bio. Poke isn't disclosed as having any formal role in Avalanche HQ, neither does Finn. The only thing that we know for certain is that Finn is an artist. Al is Billy Bob. Al is an intel guy. Billy Bob is an intel guy. What a fucking coincidence. Barrett says that Al has ways of getting codes that he doesn't understand. Billy Bob appears to be lazy on the surface, having not used any of his senior experience in Avalanche to its fullest extent, but manages to use his talent for drinking alcohol to secretly gather intel from bars. This is the secret way of how Al gets his information, the way that Barrett doesn't understand. Barrett only perceives Al, who is Billy Bob's behavior, as having a good time, without knowing that he is actually working. This is simply describing how Al gets this kind of unobtainable information. They are the same. The two groups of the three characters mentioned all fulfill the same role as one another perfectly. Not only that, but they belong to the same branch of Avalanche, Avalanche HQ. One of these groups, for no reason, seems to have vanished completely. They didn't just disappear, they are the same people. Now, you're saying to yourself, right, now, sure, each character has the same function as the other. Literally the same. That's pretty convincing, but you have yet to answer the most glaring question. Why are their names different? Because the Famitsu article gave us the answer. The key comes from one quote from the other character introduced in intermission. Juji. His quote in his bio discloses one major piece of information. Code names. You refers to you guys. It's like a secret word, a secret name for each member of Avalanche. Neo, Pogue, and Billy Bob are code names for Nellie, Finn, and Al. So with that, we can definitively say that these characters are the same. Now, I want to establish that now that we understand the context of these characters, we need to look at where their base is located, as it gives us a couple of insights as to how and why certain characters might have shown up at the end of Remake, something that will play directly into the events covered in Dirge of Cerberus, Sector 5. Just a heads up, from this point forward in the video, I will be using the names Nellie, Al, and Finn to describe those characters in order to eliminate any confusion. So just know that when I say those names, that I am also referring to the same characters mentioned in Intermission's bio. So while you may think that Avalanche HQ is operating from Sector 7, that is not the case. All they are doing is hiding there. We know that Avalanche HQ is hiding in Sector 7 because Square deliberately illustrates this point in each one of Avalanche HQ members' bios. Nelly, hiding within the Sector 7 slums. Al, members who are hidden away in the Sector 7 slums. Finn, Avalanche branch in hiding. So, if Avalanche HQ is hiding in Sector 7, then where does Avalanche HQ operate from usually? The answer to that question is Sector 5. This information is provided to us through Barrett in Chapter 5 when Barrett talks about Finn. We already confirmed that Finn is the artist from Avalanche HQ that created the stamp graffiti throughout Remake. The use of this graffiti, however, is to secretly communicate to other Avalanche members. In Chapter 5, it leads Cloud and the party out of the train tunnels. Barrett tells Cloud that the graffiti was made by their friends in Sector 5. Well, there you go. This most likely is suggesting that the friends that Barrett is referring to is not just Finn, but also Nelly and Al, Avalanche HQ. This allows us to answer some unexpected questions. Sector 5, for those who don't know, is the same place in which Aerith lives, and it is also the same place where the orphanage is located. These two places also softly hint that Sector 5 is the original place for Avalanche HQ. Biggs worked at the orphanage in Sector 5 and seemingly left without reason. We know that Biggs cared about this place deeply, so why would he have left at all? This wasn't because he didn't need work, as we know that Biggs still works. This is indicated at the beginning of Chapter 4, when Biggs looks at a poster looking for people to enlist in the Shinra army. Biggs mentions that they most likely get paid more than he does. This indicates that Biggs is still working. So if he is, why not in Sector 5? There's no specified date mentioned for his departure, but the coincidence of his departure falling somewhere in between the time of Barrett disbanding from Avalanche HQ to the current events in Remake make this very odd. Whatever was so important to cause Biggs to say goodbye to the orphanage that he cares about so deeply, a place that he asks Cloud in his final moments in Remake to keep an eye on if he doesn't survive. This might have been because Biggs left Avalanche HQ with Barrett to Sector 7, leaving behind his old job that he cares about deeply. This is also mentioned with Al, as Al gets bouquets of flowers to hit on the ladies. Barrett mentions that these flowers most likely come from Eric's garden being in Sector 5. This would further elaborate on the location in which Al and the rest of the party might have been. So, other than the mention of Finn by Barrett, there are two members of Avalanche HQ having an association with the same area, Sector 5, again further suggesting that these locations are not just coincidence. There is one more indication of this at the end of Remake, and also clears up a lot of mystery surrounding the scene. At the end of the game, Biggs is lying in a bed on the second floor of the orphanage. Beside him are flowers, most likely from Eric's garden, and Jesse's gloves, who brought him to Sector 5 specifically. The most likely thing that would have happened during the events of Platefall is someone from Avalanche HQ got Biggs and brought him back to Sector 5, perhaps somewhere close enough to HQ's base in order to keep an eye on him and nurse him back to health. Why do I believe this? Well, looking simply at the evidence, whoever did bring Biggs here had a working knowledge of Biggs's relationship with Jesse, a working knowledge of his time at the orphanage, but above anything else, they would have had a working knowledge of Biggs's involvement with Avalanche HQ in general, as nobody tells Barrett, who is in Sector 5 after Platefall, that Biggs is in the orphanage. This would mean that Biggs's survival was meant to be a secret from everyone. The only ones in particular who would have this knowledge to be so careful at this point in the story is
Wedge.
Avalanche HQ.
Oh,
Note that there
shit.
isn't any other part of Barrett's branch that could have put Biggs here. It couldn't have been Jessie, even if she was alive, which she isn't, because by the time Platefall is occurring, both Jesse and Biggs are unconscious. Wedge, at this moment in time, is also accounted for,
Damn.
and is also unconscious in Deep Ground, meaning that the only other person with a working knowledge of Biggs' relationship with Jesse and Avalanche HQ and would have brought him to this location was another Avalanche HQ member. Now, I wanted to mention this scene in particular, not only for what I just mentioned, but because I do think that this scene of Big's awakening will come back into play in a very serious way in intermission. As we have talked about already, intermission has been layering certain scenes and events from the compilation on top of events that we see directly transpiring in Remake, like Yuffie and the Materia with Rufus. While this discussion has only gone over the events that directly pertain to the core crisis so far, keep in mind moving forward that this type of integration is much broader than just the one game from the compilation. So, in conclusion, this all provides substantial evidence that Nellie, Al, and Finn are the members of Avalanche HQ in intermission. Their base is in Sector 5 and are hiding out in Sector 7, where they have aliases. But there is one more member of Avalanche HQ that I would like to bring up. Sonnen. Sonnen is mentioned to be from Wutai, but he is not mentioned to be formally a part of the Special Forces team that Yuffie is involved in. Sonon also doesn't seem to have arrived in Midgar with Yuffie either. While Sonon's bio might lead you to believe that he is, this information is intentionally obscure. This information only states that Sonon is a part of Yuffie's infiltration of Midgar and Shinra HQ. The assignment is not specified as being given to him from Wutai. So what is going on? There are a couple bits of information that
What
tell
is
you
going
who
on?
Sonon is working for. While you may think that he is introducing himself to Nellie, if you look at where he's standing, he is actually facing Yuffie when he says this. Not only that, but Nellie welcomes Sonon back, meaning that the two are already acquainted. The other indicator of this is that Sonon knows his way around Sector 7 already. In Juji's bio, he is said to be tasked with showing Yuffie around Sector 7. Sonon is purposefully excluded from this. That is because Sonon is already familiar with Sector 7. So the question you might have is, if Sonon isn't actually operating with Yuffie from Wutai, then who does he actually work for? He is working with Avalanche HQ directly. The question is why? Why is Sonon not involved with Wutai? Sonon, in every way, is a perfect candidate for the Special Operatives program that Yuffie is a part of for quite a few reasons, as Sonon has trained under Goto himself. Not only that, but Sonon is said to have joined the Wutai army at a young age, meaning that if anything, Sonon would be the perfect candidate for this special program and would be an asset to Wutai. So why isn't he? Why isn't he working from Wutai? This indicates that somewhere between the events of the Wutai War, which we know Sonon was a part of, and the Wutai War's end, Sonon became uninvolved with Wutai, and in my opinion, he defected. Sonon's expertise and his association with the army points to a very specific group that is introduced in the compilation, one that fits Sonon's desertion perfectly, as this group was created by Wutai warriors like himself, the Crescent Unit and the Wutai Remnants. The Wutai Remnants are a small group of Wutai army soldiers who banded together to confront Shinra after the Wutai War. But while this group is made up of soldiers from the Wutai army, There is no indication that what they are doing is in association with Wutai directly, as the emails in Crisis Core that are sent to Zack specifically that they are a detached Wutai army. Note that these groups also have separate branches, very much like Avalanche, meaning that they are most likely all rogue groups of Wutai soldiers, meaning that where Wutai may have given up on fighting Shinra, the army did not. And in order to restore Wutai to its former glory, they continue to operate to destroy Shinra. This is further insinuated by just how defeated Goto is by the time the ceasefire is instated. And rather than trying to restore Wutai's honor, Goto just gives up. Goto's inaction is the same catalyst for Yuffie's efforts to restore Wutai honor, which I can only imagine is the same drive that the Wutai remnants would have as well. But that's not all the Wutai remnants are driven by, as there is one thing that clearly separates their motivation: revenge. The Wutai remnants not only fight Shinra, but aim to claim their revenge on Soldier, specifically Zack Fair, who was involved in the defeat of Wutai at the end of the Wutai War. The drive for revenge that the Wutai remnants have, a group of Wutai soldiers who fought in the Wutai War, who seemingly have no tie with Wutai, all of these motivations are directly reflected in Sona. Where Yuffie's drive is to restore honor to Wutai, Sona's drive is to get revenge, most likely for his sister, which is noted in Intergrade's trailer. So whether Sona has an association directly or not, these differing motivations seem to be very present in Yuffie and Sona's relationship, and it is very clear from the trailer that they do not really see eye to eye. And I have a feeling that this will most likely be the catalyst for some sort of conflict between the two characters, as their ideologies, much like the dynamic set with Avalanche HQ and Barrett, clearly separates them. So, now that we know all of the parties and the characters and their backgrounds in regards to Avalanche, Wutai, and Shinra, we need to start looking at the story of Remake and Intermission. How does all of this information translate directly into Remake's story? All of this is done so perfectly. We will be going over the events of Chapter 1, Chapter 4, and go into the final Shinra HQ event. So while you may think to yourself that all of this is familiar territory to you, know that there is an underlying new story being told in every single one of the events we go over before Remake. A year before the events of Remake began, Barrett, who was a Midgar Avalanche lead, was booted from Avalanche HQ. This meant that Barrett no longer would be able to have any formal contact between Avalanche HQ and his group. Their actions, including all of their activities and information, would be withheld from being disclosed to him. Just to be clear, that goes for Avalanche as a bigger entity, but also the other branches and their separate activities. Simply put, Barrett was fired. When Barrett gets the boot, Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, having worked under Barrett and believing in what he stood for, left Avalanche HQ as well. It's around this time that they all formed Barrett's unofficial Avalanche group. Sometime later, prior to the first bombing mission at the start of Remake, a warehouse in Sector 7 is looted for gunpowder. You heard me correctly. The same warehouse that you loot later in the game is looted prior to Barrett's party's first bombing run. This gunpowder, which was looted from that warehouse, is then acquired by Jesse, as the gunpowder is the same ingredient that Jesse uses to create the bombs in the first bombing mission. Note that at this point in the story, Jessie isn't acquiring this gunpowder herself. She is going through an unnamed supplier. It's extremely important to keep in mind that at this point in the story, Barrett's group of Avalanche has not done anything substantial and has been completely off the radar up until the first bombing mission. They haven't blown up any reactors or raised any suspicion. And because of that, while they aren't officially a part of Avalanche HQ anymore, their connection to the headquarters seems to be on good enough terms at this particular time to still gain some benefit from their original branch. Not long after this, Tifa proposes that Barrett hire her old friend. The bombing run. Barrett's Avalanche begins their infiltration. Jesse, while using passcodes to get the Reactor 1 doors open, discloses to Cloud that she was able to get these passcodes from her former branch member, and that it's a shame that no one else at HQ will talk to them. To which she cites the disagreement between Avalanche HQ and Barrett's party. This is important as this is the second instance where Avalanche HQ members, specifically Melly, Al, and Finn, are brought up and are actively affecting the story. This time it's Al, who we know is able to acquire passcodes for Avalanche HQ. Barrett's Avalanche most likely reached out to get passcodes that would allow them to access the reactor. I know I said that this is the second instance of Avalanche HQ helping. That will also come back into play later. This also communicates that while there is a disconnect between Barrett's branch and the other Avalanche branches, and with Avalanche HQ, they still have some communication established at this time in the story. So the Reactor 1 mission is successful, and Cloud gets a lesson on Midgard from Jesse. In the Japanese dialogue, Jesse makes it clear that she is the one creating the fake IDs, to which she explains their importance. The IDs hold all information about an individual that Shimmer needs to know, the most important being their level of access. Jesse's IDs are only suitable for basic clearance in Midgard. This allows them to take trains just like any normal citizen. This also goes for Nelly's fake IDs as well. Yes, Nelly creates fake IDs for Avalanche HQ, just like Jesse. Keep this in mind for later. But keep in mind that both of these teams' fake IDs do not have special perks. Moving right on to Chapter 3. Shinra begins investigating gunpowder stolen from a warehouse incident prior to the first bombing run. This investigation leads the Shinra officers to Johnny, not because he is implicated in any Avalanche activity, as we know from his bio that he isn't a part of Avalanche, but more so because he can't keep his mouth shut, and there is a chance that Johnny can point the Shinra troops in the direction of Avalanche. The Shinra troops get Johnny to give them Jesse's name, with no context. The Shinra troops do this by telling Johnny that his name came up in the warehouse records. They then indicate that this was a ploy to get Johnny to spill the beans, and that even if his ID was used to try and get into the warehouse, he doesn't have enough clearance to get in. This again echoes what we have talked about with the IDs so far, and also tell us, the audience, that Johnny isn't the supplier for Jesse for the gunpowder. He's just an idiot. Somewhere around the same time, Jesse tries to get into contact with her supplier for more gunpowder, and is denied. This is confirmed by the fact that Jesse tries to hire Cloud before the group's celebration for their next mission. This means that at this point in the story, Jesse has already formulated her own plan to get into the warehouse to get the gunpowder she needs for the bombs for the next mission. During the group's pre-celebration for the next mission, Barrett's group reflects on the road that led them to this moment. This is what comes up. Barrett's group was kicked out. Jesse is still mad about the separation. Everyone else is chummy about it, but Jesse doesn't want to talk about it. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering to yourself, how does everything we talked about give context for Integrate? This all comes to a head in Chapter 4. Jesse hires Cloud to take her to Sector 7's topside and break into her father's room to get his key card. His ID giving Jesse the clearance to access the warehouse. The same warehouse that was mentioned earlier in the game. The same one that Jesse's supplier got the gunpowder from. Biggs and Wedge join them with their new fake IDs and some bikes. But because of their level of clearance, the group alerts security on their way up to the warehouse. Not because their IDs don't scan properly, but because of the time of night and the level of access they have. After that, Cloud successfully gets Jesse's father's keycard, and Jesse begins sneaking into the warehouse from the back, while Cloud with Biggs and Wedge goes in through the front to take attention away from Jesse looting in the warehouse. This is because even though she has the card, there's still a potential for Jesse to be caught by Shinra troops. Upon starting the mission, Cloud, Biggs, and Wedge notice that someone else has already knocked out the Shinra guards. This happens before Jesse alerts the party to her entering the facility. This is clarified later that the guards being knocked out was Avalanche HQ's doing. The gate that seemingly guards the warehouse is open, and guards are patrolling the front. They then indicate that they were sent on patrol to find some form of intruder, but have not spotted any. This indicates to us that there is some sort of infiltration already happening, but the infiltration has gone mostly unnoticed until the guards spot Cloud, to which Shinra overwhelms the party, harming Wedge. Old Guard, who has sided with Avalanche HQ, suddenly appears out of nowhere, mind you, and begins pushing back against the Shinra security and picks Wedge up. Biggs leads Cloud away from the conflict unfolding with Avalanche HQ and they retreat. Biggs mentions that Avalanche struck a deal with Wutai with the intent of taking all of the materia in Midgard. Then the gate closes. Shinra then pulls up to block all entrances and exits. Then Cloud and Biggs meet up with Jesse, and Wedge is blocked off from a passing truck. The indication there being that Avalanche is in the Shinra truck and make their escape. So, as you can see, there's a lot to talk about. Let's start off by saying
I always thought that was weird. Wedge getting dropped off like that.
Larger story. But where do we start? Let's start off at the beginning. If the warehouse that Jesse is looting is the same warehouse that is mentioned as being looted before Remake began, and this warehouse still has the gunpowder that Jesse needs to create more bombs for the next mission, then why would Jesse's supplier ignore her? It's not because the warehouse's lack of supplies as Jesse is successful in retrieving the gunpowder. So what changed between then and now in regards to Jesse and her supplier? The answer to why the supplier does not respond to her would be due to the events of Mako Reactor 1. At this point in the story, Barrett's group has drawn a considerable amount of attention to themselves. Don Corneo's men begin investigating the slums in search of Barrett's location. We learn from Don Corneo himself later that this search was demanded by Heidegger for President Shinra. This was done in order to confirm the location of Barrett's avalanche, and after finding them, Shinra plans to drop the plate to eliminate them. Now, it's very important to note that after Mako Reactor 1's explosion, there is no other contact that Barrett's Avalanche group has with Avalanche HQ. There are no more codes shared, no information or supplies given. Nothing that Barrett and the rest of the party do have anything to do with Avalanche HQ. This means that at the point in which Jesse's mission starts, Avalanche HQ is no longer providing the support to Barrett's group the way they had before. Now, the other strange coincidence is that Avalanche HQ shows up to the warehouse before Jesse and Cloud did. Now, Jesse was only able to gain access to the warehouse because of her father's ID. This was because it had high-level clearance. Avalanche HQ was, and is currently, able to get into the warehouse with the same level of clearance or higher. This not only allowed Avalanche HQ to move through the warehouse without revealing their identities through the prior mentioned ID log, and do so without a distraction. As we know from the warehouse gate being opened, Avalanche HQ came in through the front of the warehouse, meaning that they were able to move through the warehouse freely in plain sight. We know that the soldiers' reaction to finding Cloud that Avalanche HQ was able to move through the warehouse without being detected by Shinra soldiers or raise any alarm. The only time that Avalanche HQ reveals itself is when an armed group of old guards shows up after the warehouse has already been put on high alert. The point I am trying to make here is that Avalanche HQ would have, without raising any suspicion, would have been able to go into the warehouse and out of it without ever having been detected. As we know from the prior warehouse heist, it seems as though the warehouse theft wasn't really accounted for, which caused Shinra to go looking for any type of security breach. That the logs indicated nothing strange, which is why the Shinra troops went to Johnny in the first place, which indicates that the only reason Old Guard showed up the way they did, guns blazing, is because Jesse and Cloud alerted the warehouse and messed up Avalanche HQ's plan. And now that the warehouse was on high alert, the people inside needed a different escape route. One that we know Avalanche HQ has in place in the form of a Shimmer truck. This indicates to me that the only party equipped enough to have retrieved the gunpowder to begin with for Jesse at the beginning of Remake was Avalanche HQ. They are the only ones with enough clearance, equipment, and knowledge to do so. Meaning whoever Jesse's supplier was someone in Avalanche, someone who Jesse had an open line of communication with. And as we know from the first bombing mission, the only connection she had to Avalanche was with her former branch at Avalanche HQ. And it just so happens that there is one character in Avalanche HQ who is the designated supplier of other branches of Avalanche. A character who has a close relationship with Jesse, and that is Nelly. Nelly is the only person in the entire game that meets every bit of criteria to be the prime suspect for Jesse's supplier. Now, I want to say that if I am right, which I do believe I am right, that if Jesse's supplier is
Starting
in
to sound
fact
like
Nelly, this creates way more character development, not only for Jesse, but
Breaking
especially for
Bad.
Nelly, and we haven't even met her yet. Nelly and Jesse. There's a lot of context to see that Jesse and Nellie's relationship has been a little rocky since Barrett's division was formed. This is given some context when we look back on Barrett's Avalanche, reflecting on their journey so far before the second bombing mission, where the group has seemingly moved on from the split with Avalanche HQ. Jesse has clearly not. Jesse is upset because the split not only divided the branch, but it divided Jesse and Nellie's relationship. At the end of the day, they both made their choices to stay with one side or the other. And keep in mind that the characterization for Jessie in Remake paints her involvement in Avalanche as extremely personal, meaning that the goal for Jessie isn't just to save the planet, it is to save her father. Now you would think that anything stopping her from reaching that goal is going to rub her the wrong way. So what was the disagreement? What caused Nellie to deny Jesse the gunpowder? Barrett's branch destroyed their first reactor, to which it goes horribly over the line and causes enough damage to endanger the lives of the people in Sector 1. At this moment in time, this solidifies the differences between the two parties, and there is no turning back. This is where Nelly, as well as Avalanche HQ as a whole, draws the line. Because of their decision to assist Jesse in a seemingly harmless way, has now gone against all of what Avalanche HQ stands for. So the decision is made to no longer enable Jesse and the rest of Barrett's Avalanche. Hence the reason Jesse is unable to get in touch with Nelly for supplies. This is why, in the trailer, Nelly is hesitating to approach Barrett and Tifa. It's because there are a lot of conflicting feelings. While there is the desire in Nelly to approach Barrett's group, as they are her friends, and there is a want for her to warn them about the imminent platefall, which Avalanche HQ does know about, she cannot. Being the overseer of her branch, Nelly sees the actions of Barrett's branch as not only a liability to Avalanche HQ's safety, but also to Avalanche HQ's mission. And ultimately, yes, this is Shinra's fault, but neither Barrett or Jesse know that. So at the end of the day, all of these actions fall directly onto Barrett's decisions. Because what is the direct result of Barrett's cavalier behavior? Barrett reveals Avalanche in the first bombing mission, causing Shinra to start searching for Avalanche. Don Corneo's men locate Barrett in Sector 7, which leads Heidegger and the President not only to use his actions to fuel the propaganda to wage war with Wutai, it also leads them to the decision to drop the Sector 7 plate to end Barrett's Avalanche, which leads to not only Jesse's death, but the many innocent lives in Sector 7. So what is this all for? Not only does this give Nelly and the rest of Avalanche HQ a mountain of character development to easily explore in intermission, but it is also to expand on Barrett's character, because the weight of all of these events and the repercussions of Barrett's actions are directly reflected in Barrett's resolution scene. What keeps Barrett up at night is thinking about Nellie, Al, and Finn. He is thinking about them because Barrett doesn't know if they are alive at this point in the story or not, because he knows that he put their lives in danger the same way he put his own branch at risk. He is sleepless because he is wrestling with the thought that maybe all of these deaths and all of these events and the death of his friends are all because of what he's done. What is this internal struggle a direct reflection of for Barrett? Well, this is a one for one of the same character development that Barrett gets in Carell, and this same feeling of responsibility for his actions is the same dynamic that Dine creates for Barrett as a character later on in the original game. Ultimately, Barrett isn't responsible for this, and he will ultimately need to address that. All that Remake has set up for him is to confront that in a bigger way than he did in the original. To conclude this thought, this is what Remake is masterful at. All of what it is working towards is for the purpose of setting up a layered context, not only to expand on the lore into the original game, but also gives us interesting character dynamics and conflict. This same concept will directly parallel the next character we are going to talk about. Now, while you think we're done, we're not, which might have you screaming, but this is what happens when you need the full scope of information. Because we skipped over the most obvious reason for Chapter 4 to begin with. How did Avalanche manage to get into the warehouse twice without being detected?
Rufus.
HQ introduction. Avalanche HQ
Come
has
on.
ID clearance that is clearly above the ability of any fake ID card produced by Nellie or Jesse. One that is not only high clearance, but doesn't flag suspicion in the system.
Rufus, or the mayor guy.
Avalanche HQ. Avalanche
Domino?
HQ also
What's his
had
name?
the ability to move around the warehouse without being detected.
I was gonna say Domino
Not
or
only
Rufus.
inside of the warehouse, but also on the way out of the warehouse. Avalanche HQ being able to get past a Shimmer Troop security checkpoint right outside of the warehouse without being immediately identified as Avalanche. An escape route with a Shimra security truck with IDs that would not be flagged by any highway security system, like Jesse and Clouds did during Avalanche HQ's
I mean, unless it's gonna be
you
like
see what this would all require? An ID with high-level access to the doors,
the
as well as
Turks
enough
or something.
clearance to ensure that these security checkpoints on the highway
I don't
are
think it's the
not
Turks.
triggering any suspicion, and a disguise for not only the interior of the warehouse, but also for the security checkpoint on the way out, as well as a Shinra truck. If you don't see what's going on now, you will in a second. Here is the easier question. Why does Avalanche HQ want the gunpowder? We know that Avalanche HQ is a non-lethal group, so if they are not planning on blowing up reactors, then what are they attempting to accomplish? This is where we get to integrate Shinra HQ. In Avalanche HQ's Sector 7 location, we see a whiteboard with 3 defining blueprints from Shinra HQ. One is the Shinra HQ lobby. One is the library in which Mayor Domino is located. One is the food court in which the Avalanche supporter awaits to give the party further access to the upper floors. 2 helicopters are also featured on this board, which should also be triggering that part of your brain that asks you how they got such detailed information on Shinra HQ, as well as how Avalanche HQ gets these helicopters. Which, by the way, when these do show up, they are specifically Shinra helicopters. Everything depicted on the whiteboard are the necessary locations in order to get access to the floors that we needed to get to President Shinra's office. This plan seemingly has been the primary focus of Avalanche HQ, this attack on Shinra HQ. So everything that they have been doing up until this point has been in an effort to focus their efforts on a single attack, rather than endangering the lives of people through the destruction of reactors. The plan is as stated by Wedge at a later part of the game to flush out the president. Keep this in mind here, their goal is not to kill the president, but to get him out in the open. Why? Because this is not Avalanche HQ's plan. That is because from his father and assume control as the president of Shinra Electric Power Company. The entire point of his mission in Before Crisis,
And you
his
fucked that
entire
up.
reasoning for faking Avalanche's defeat, all being realized, all of his actions from the beginning advance him towards this moment. But as we know from the events of Remake, this does not go off without some issues. And that is because this plan is once again hijacked by Cloud and his party. Seriously, every step of the way, Barrett's team is making this difficult. So now we are going to quickly go through the events that take place here. As we can see, upon the arrival of Cloud's party, Shinra has already received word that there is some sort of plan in motion to attack the Shinra building. This will be important when we discuss Yuffie's mission. As we know from the timing of events, Cloud's group arrives first, beating Avalanche to the punch, at least to the upper floors of Shinra HQ. The reason we know this is because upon meeting Domino, that this meeting was anticipated by Mayor Domino. But Mayor Domino learns later in that conversation that they are not here to give Shinra his comeuppance, as Cloud's party's plan was not the one Mayor Domino was informed of, to which he suspects that Barrett's branch wasn't informed. We do know, however, after the drum, Cloud passes out and wakes up. Biggs has already arrived with Mayor Domino. This means that at this moment in time, while Cloud and party did beat Avalanche HQ up to the upper floors, Avalanche HQ has caught up, and then the bombs go off. Let me say that again. The bombs go off. Avalanche HQ's goal in Chapter 4 was to get the gunpowder from the warehouse to build bombs for this moment. Now, this is extremely important. In between the moment of Cloud passing out and him awakening, there is a random scene with the Turks, where they are called by Rufus to retrieve him. As we know, Rufus arrived in Midgard sometime after Platefall, meaning that Rufus is in an undisclosed location in Midgard already. The timing of Avalanche HQ's plan and the call with Rufus perfectly coincides with the following events. Cloud's party is told by Wedge that he asked Avalanche HQ to help him get Cloud's party out of Shinra HQ. This might seem obvious, but this is very important to note, is that this means that Melly, Al, and Finn are most likely alive. And this once again clarifies that they were able to get out of Sector 7 before Platefall. Not only that, but Wedge was able to locate them, which we know where Wedge was by the time that Cloud's group set out to infiltrate Shinra, and that he is in Sector 5. It's like, how much more convincing do I have to be? Also note that because of Avalanche putting its plan into motion officially, the building is put on lockdown, removing access to every door in Shinra HQ, except for the drum. Remember this elevator. Cloud is instructed to move through the drum and to the helipad outside of President Shinra's office, to which Cloud arrives, and the president has been thrown out of some glass and now hangs on the helipad railing. President Shinra is then killed after fighting Genova, a Shinra helicopter with Avalanche's A painted on the side of it, being piloted by two members of Old Guard appear. The Old Guard pilot reports back directly to Avalanche HQ, stating that it is making another run to search for friendlies, indicating that this helicopter has already done this before. Rufus shoots down the helicopter and then arrives. At the end of this fight with Cloud, Rufus remarks that this is a new era for Shinra. Do you see it now? Each moment in succession, the call from Rufus, the execution of Avalanche HQ's plan, the president's situation, his death, the arrival of Rufus Shinra, and his claim of a new era beginning. Rufus Shinra, from before Crisis all the way up until this moment in Remake, has been in charge of Avalanche the entire time. This entire time, he was in power, and it was right under everyone's nose. From Elf's death to his assistants in the warehouse to Shinra HQ, this has been Rufus's plan to finally succeed in killing his father. Realize every step methodically calculated and then executed. This is the full scope of Rufus, the full scope of who he is as a character, as introduced in the compilation. All that he is capable of is being delivered to us in Remake. And now he has every single element of the world's powers, Avalanche, Wutai, and Shinra, all threads that connect to this one man's actions. This provides us in every single way, shape, or form the entire story of Avalanche, both past and present, Wutai's established connection to Avalanche and Rufus, and how Remake has given us everything that the compilation has to offer, and done so to expand and deepen all of its characters, Barrett's conflict, Rufus's masterful planning, and the deeper character development of characters we haven't even met yet. This is the full power of Final Fantasy VII, all for the point of fantastic storytelling. And you want to know what the best fucking part is? This isn't the only thing that Remake is giving its complete self to. As we know, Dirge of Cerberus in its full force in Remake's story, with the reveal of Vice, a thread which not only gives us everything we need to know about Dirge of Cerberus's inclusion into Remake, but sets the stage for a character that we have been talking about for so.
Genesis.
At last, the time has come. Now, let the hunts begin.
Why, sir?
Deep Ground. I never thought Square would just do this so blatantly. Before Crisis and Dirge of Cerberus are both being used to their fullest extent. Deep Ground's inclusion in the game in such a large way, including the reveal of Vice, including the reveal of Deep Ground soldiers, indicates a lot of direction that we have previously talked about on this channel. It also hints at a larger character's involvement in the story going forward, Genesis. Now, we know that Dirge of Cerberus takes place after the events of Advent Children, and while that time does hold some very major significance to what we see in Intermission, we're going to be looking at a widely mysterious part of Dirge of Cerberus that actually takes place during the events of the original game, and that is Dirge of Cerberus's multiplayer story. This story was meant to act as a prequel of events to what takes place during DOC's main story. This prequel story features the inner workings of Deep Ground and all of the antagonists of Dirge of Cerberus's main story. The events disclose the background of many of those characters and explain how they come to be a real threat 3 years after the original events of Final Fantasy VII. And from those findings, we're going to determine what we can expect to see in Intermission. What are the events that we know have happened in Deep Ground at the time of OG? Who can we expect to see because of this? And what does this location in Yuffie's chapter in Deep Ground mean for where we can expect Yuffie's story to end up? And where does that take us in regards to Remake's bigger picture? So in order to understand the events of the multiplayer, you need to understand what exactly is going on between the Deep Ground soldiers, who are all a part of a secret rebellion, and the powers that are put into place by Shinra. The Deep Ground soldiers who comprise the rebellion are Vice, the leader of the Deep Ground Rebellion, and he is also known as the Emperor, and the Colored Sphiets. Colored Sphiets are the most powerful experiments in all of Deep Ground. This is because these experiments were given Genesis's genes that are a direct result of Genesis's birth, enhancing them beyond that of of normal deep ground experiments. So just know here that right off the bat, this further gives legitimacy to Genesis's involvement in Remake's story, simply by the fact that Vice is even in Remake. If you think you know where this is all going, there is way more to that than meets the eye. Trust me. But we're going to get to that a bit later. The colored Spiettes are made up of Vice the Immaculate, his brother Nero the Sable, Rosso the Crimson, Azul the Cerulean, Shelk the Transparent, and Argento. Then there's the entirety of the regular Spiettes, the elite soldiers of Deep Ground, and then regular Deep Ground soldiers. The above mentioned are so Mako dependent that their only way in which they can survive is through the suits that they wear, and Mako bats, the same suits that we see in Intermission. This group and the colored Spiettes are all essentially prisoners in Deep Ground, held against their will to be a part of the experiments of Deep Ground scientists. All of these prisoners are dedicated to Vice, as he is the strongest amongst the Deep Ground soldiers and is the heart of the rebellion. All of these groups together make up this secret rebellion. Now, the ones appointed to watch over Deep Ground and all of its experimentation for Shinra are soldiers who are in control of Deep Ground, the Restrictors, characters that have had the entirety of their identities removed from any official records, all in an effort by Shinra to keep the experiments of Deep Ground a complete secret. Deep Ground is a place for human experimentation, and the goal of these experiments is to create the most powerful soldiers for President Shinra's use. These experiments are those born in Deep Ground, created in Deep Ground, or people who have volunteered willingly to participate in these experiments, or are captured individuals that once lived on the surface of Gaia. The point is that all Deep Ground soldiers are essentially kept in Deep Ground against their will, and regardless of how they feel about their situation, they must fight each other in order to stay alive. The reason for this forced conflict is not only to test the experiments and make them stronger, it is also done to collect battle data that is then gathered and used for further experimentation on both existing members and to create new specimens. This process is repeated over and over and over and over until they get the absolute best result, the strongest soldier possible. So, Vice, the strongest colored Spiet in Deep Ground, decides one day that he no longer wishes to be a slave to Deep Ground. So, he, along with the other colored Spiets, decide that they wish to break free from Shinra's control and take over Deep Ground. But, as you are about to find out, this is a lot more difficult than it sounds, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first one being a program known as Lady Patricia. Lady Patricia is the program in charge of keeping the Spiets under the control of Shinra. This is done through a program chip that is implanted into each experiment in Deep Ground. And through those chips, Lady Patricia gives the restrictors, the overseers of Deep Ground, the ability to immediately take control of and subdue the body of any Deep Ground soldier. This system is implemented in order to keep Deep Ground soldiers from ever being able to challenge the restrictors, thus allowing them to always have the power needed to stay in control of any situation. So know that while the restrictors have this level of control over every Deep Ground soldier through these chips, and are powerful soldiers in their own right, they need this power in order to subdue not only disobedient Deep Ground soldiers, but also Deep Ground soldiers that are more powerful than they are. The only ones notably able to even come close to resisting the chip's power are Vice and Nero. That while the chip effectively stops them in their tracks, they are able to resist this power much more effectively than anyone else. For this reason, the restrictors also take extra precaution with Nero and Vice by restraining them in different parts of Deep Ground. Most notably, Vice's throne room. At the center of Mako Reactor 0, a reactor located just below Shinra HQ. This will be very important to know for later. I want to very quickly mention that all of the information I just gave you, which is from Dirge of Cerberus lore, is all featured in Vice's official bio in Intergrade. That he is the Emperor of Deep Ground, but chained up to his throne. That alone gives us a lot. Square is very aware of what is happening when in Final Fantasy VII lore, and are staying true to that. Also, this starts giving us an accurate time frame of events, as we also know from Dirge and subsequently the intermission bio, Vice is not to be freed from his shackles unless he is being experimented on. And he is not permanently freed from these shackles until after his rebellion is complete, which means that the restrictors are still in control of Deep Ground in intermission. But there's still more to get from the story than just this piece of info. So, with all of these safety measures in mind, what exactly does Vice and the other colored Spiettes do to overthrow the restrictors, thus gaining their freedom? This is where the plot of Dirge of Cerberus's multiplayer comes in. One of the colored Spiettes, Shulk, uses the ability S&D, an ability that allows someone to explore the worldwide network, essentially the internet in Final Fantasy VII, in the form of a virtual reality. Shulk is then able to tamper with chips before they are implanted into new experiments to give certain newly instated Deep Ground soldiers a defective chip. This step allows certain new recruits, i.e. your player character in the multiplayer story, the ability to fight against the restrictors without being affected by the restraints of the chip through Patricia. Then, in order to incentivize your player to kill the restrictors, Shulk once again uses her ability of SND, which also has the ability to download and create memories inside of the minds of others, implants memories into your character. These memories being of traumatic events that leads the player to believe that the restrictors killed their family. This is done not only to ensure that the new recruits are willing to do whatever it takes to kill the restrictors, it also removes any focus of suspicion from the other colored Spiettes and keeps it all on them. It's important to keep in mind that while Shulk gets to access Lady Patricia by the restrictors frequently, as she is often called upon to fix any errors that occur with her programming, Shulk isn't able to modify any chips that have already been installed into older Deep Ground soldiers, like the ones in Vice and the other colored Spiettes. She is only able to modify them before they are implanted. So know that in order to truly be free from the control that the restrictors have over Deep Ground, Patricia is not the issue. The issue is the power that the chips give the restrictors. So as long as every single restrictor is alive, then there is no way for the Deep Ground soldiers, the colored Spiettes, or even Vice to truly free themselves from the control that Shinra has over them. This is a key reason why the colored Spiettes' plan is executed in such a particular way. All in secret and all very carefully. All in an attempt to not raise any awareness of the plan to the restrictors. The restrictors, at certain points in the story, do realize that there are some defective chips in certain recruits. But in these instances, restrictors just kill these defects. That means that even if one of Shulk's mind-warped Deep Ground soldiers are successful in staying alive long enough to make them a candidate for the rest of the colored Spiettes' plans, the restrictors will murder them without a second thought if they found out that they have defective chips. This is just further highlighting how delicate and painful this process is. A process that the colored Spiettes even complain about at the end of the multiplayer, as there's just so much that can go wrong. So during the Dirge of Cerberus multiplayer story events, the player assumes the role of a new recruit for Deep Ground. in which the player is forced to take up arms against his fellow recruits and fight to climb the ranks. This character, having worked his or her way up to earn the title of a Spiet, is granted the opportunity to fight Vice, an opportunity given to anyone who earns this ranking. During your challenge of Vice, the player, with their unrestricted will, through their defected chip and their false drive to rebel against the restrictors, help Vice murder a single restrictor by distracting him long enough for Vice to make a move against him. This is the first instance of Deep Down's rebellion killing a restrictor. This moment, which will be important to keep in mind for the timing of intermission. This is where the full extent of the plan is explained. The plan here is to take the armor of the recently slain restrictor and then put one of Shelt's puppets, who is also a Spiet, into the restrictor's armor. This Spiet is to then assume the identity of the restrictor that was slain. This accomplishes something very important. This allows for Vice's rebellion to go undetected by the other restrictors. And while you may think the restrictors would sniff out the ruse immediately, restrictors are actually unaware of each other's identities. We also never see more than one restrictor at a time, which indicates perhaps that they aren't even really around each other as far as we can tell, or they just operate separately from one another. For that reason, this kind of disguise is almost impossible to notice. This allows Vice, with the help of the colored Spiets and the mind-controlled Spiets, to repeat this plan over and over to pick off every single restrictor, all without alerting not just the restrictors, but the deep ground scientists and Shinra to Vice's rebellion. And when I say repeat the plan, I mean from top to bottom repeat. Create the defective chip, get that deep ground soldier to Spiet ranking, then have them fight Vice under the watch of a restrictor, then kill that restrictor. Keep in mind that this process takes quite a bit of time as it is, but is getting more and more time consuming. It's highlighted by a restrictor that as the experiments in Deep Ground get stronger, the Spiet program is getting more and more rigorous, meaning less of a chance for a defected chipped soldier to rise in the ranks. All of these factors slow the process of the rebellion. So, what is the end goal of the plan? The end goal here is to do this with every single restrictor in Deep Ground. And once the elimination of all the restrictors is accomplished in secret, Vice and all of Deep Ground will be able to be free. If anyone were to become aware of this coup, it would end in the death or termination of all the Spiets involved, and or the restrictors putting yet another safety measure to prevent something like this from ever happening again. So, though this painful method of slowly replacing the restrictors is tedious and time consuming and frustrating to explain, this is the only means for Vice and the rest of the rebellion to achieve this plan, the virus. So that's all right. That's all there is to it. If you thought that this was the end of the madness that is this convoluted plot, then you are absolutely dead wrong. Because if Vice and his fellow Spiets do end up killing all of the restrictors, there is still one particular safety measure that the restrictors have over Deep Ground, and that is the virus inside of Vice. Yeah, this virus is only triggered when the entirety of the restrictors are killed. Once this happens, this final safety measure will kill Vice in 3 days. That sounds like a trap card in Yu-Gi-Oh! As stupid as this might sound to you, this one safety measure is brilliant on account of how much damage this would do. The obvious being that Vice is clearly such a liability for shit to go wrong that they took every precaution needed for him to never be allowed to escape. If he ever were to, it would end very poorly for everyone involved. So even if this were to happen, they would still be okay as a group, right? The most relevant reason for this being kind of brilliant, Vice is actually integral to the unity of Deep Ground and the rebellion. He is massively respected by the Deep Ground soldiers, meaning that even if they did manage to kill each restrictor and free themselves from Shinra's control, Vice's death would be a major blow to the unity of Deep Ground. I will state that there isn't any other person to take his place either. Nero, Rosso, and Azul are all entirely mad, and Shelp is not respected by any of the other members of the Spiets, meaning that the only sane person keeping the ship afloat and keeping them from all killing each other is Vice. He, ironically, is the stabilizer. Without him, it would be absolute fucking chaos. So, what does Vice do about the virus? Well, the virus has no inherent cure. So, what this forces Vice to inevitably do is use the ability in which he has acquired from Shulk to go into S&D. Yes, Vice has the power of all of the other colored Spiets. He is able to duplicate himself like Rosso. He is able to use S&D like Shulk. And very presumably, he has the abilities of Azul and Nero, which you best believe that in his fight in Intergrade, you're going to be seeing all of these abilities. I'm calling it right now that you're going to see all of the colored Spiet's abilities being utilized in their fullest by Vice. Now, just know that the activation of this virus doesn't happen until much later in the story. And when I say much later in the story, I mean around the time in which Dirge of Cerberus takes place, 3 years after the events of OG. So, as we know, Deep Ground continues within Intergrade's story just as it has been described here. A lot of people are using S&D as a signifier of the time and events when Vice has activated the virus. This is false. While this could be seen as an indicator for that event, it's important to keep in mind that Vice has had this ability of S&D prior to the virus being triggered. So, the most likely reason that we see Vice forming himself in the battle simulation is that he simply is using S&D to gain access to fight whoever is in there currently. As we know from Dirge of Cerberus' online multiplayer mode, Vice, unless he is partaking in an experiment, is always shackled to his throne in Maka Reactor Zero. And because of this, the only way in which you would ever fight him is if you were in Deep Ground in his throne room. So, in conclusion of this segment, Vice is still alive and actively seeking out his plans to kill each of the restrictors. The restrictors are still in power, meaning by the time of Intergrade's story, Shinra still has its hold over the Deep Ground soldiers. Now that we have the context of the entirety of the Deep Ground story, all that is left to do is look at the pieces of this story in its context and apply it to Remake. The first thing that I stated at the beginning of this conversation was that the events of Dirge of Cerberus' multiplayer take place around the time of the events transpiring during Remake. And this is true. Not only is it proven from Vice's imprisonment mentioned in his bio, we also have an indicator in the multiplayer and in intermission of the exact timing to place exactly what point these events in UV's story are unfolding, and that is with Vice's swords. In the ending of the Dirge of Cerberus multiplayer, Vice is set to challenge your player, as well as Rosso and Azul. It is at this time that Vice mentions that he would like to try his new toys. These new toys being the signature Heaven and Earth gunblades that Vice is known for. As we see from Intergrade's trailer, Vice does have these swords with him, and since we can account for the period of time of these two events, this allows us to identify that Intergrade is taking place after the DOC multiplayer. So this gives us the only time frame in which we can expect intermissions events in Deep Ground to be taking place, and that is during Deep Ground's efforts to kill the remaining restrictors. Having already killed one, but seemingly having not killed them all. Hence, Vice's swords in integrating. So, what is the importance of time and place? Well, that is because we can now accurately talk about who we might see in Deep Ground other than Vice. As Nomura stated in an interview after the trailer's release, Vice is not the only one we should be expecting to see, and is not Yuffie's final boss. Looking at Dirge of Cerberus's interviews, there was a strong desire from the team developing Dirge of Cerberus for the Spiettes to be in some way, shape, or form in other Final Fantasy VII games. And while back then there wasn't an opportunity to do so, there is now. There are also other pretty certain indicators that Remake is already setting this up, and some other smaller details already in the integrate trailer. So I will go over each Deep Ground character in no particular order and why they are the most likely to appear in the story from a lore perspective. And while I would like all of them to be featured in some way in intermission, Lord knows Square has been literally giving me more than I can even ask for at this point. I am just making sure that if they don't all appear, which they should, at least we can determine the most likely reasoning as to have not. And in turn, who would be the most likely? The characters. Azul the Cerulean. Azul the Cerulean, a colored Spiet who has been put through the metamorphosis experiments, has a reference in the segment of Deep Ground in Remake already. This reference was previously discussed on another one of my videos, but just for the context, the horns on the Type 0 behemoth that you fight in the Deep Ground segment of Remake are in fact the same horns found on Azul in his behemoth form, Arch Azul. So rather than this reference just being a nod, I think it's foreshadowing. As we know from the Dirge of Cerberus multiplayer, Azul is one of the few colored Spiets that isn't restricted to certain areas of Deep Ground. Those who would be are Rosso, Vice, and Nero. And it is for this reason that I think that he would be the most likely to appear in the story, as he is the one that has the most presence in the base game so far and enough access in Deep Ground. Shulk. Shulk might seem like a weird choice, as there is nothing that alludes to her presence in the main story of Remake. She, however, more than any other colored Spiet, is allowed a wider access to Deep Ground. Her skill set is used for required maintenance through all of Deep Ground. It is for this reason that her presence in any part of Deep Ground is more certain than any other colored Spiet. She also can monitor most of the activity that takes place in Deep Ground. Through her S&D ability, she can literally see out of every helmet worn by the Deep Ground soldiers. I would also like to mention once again that we see Vice use his power of S&D in the integrated trailer. And the only way in which Vice would have this ability is through Shulk being present somewhere in the story. So, not only is she already alluded to through this ability, her level of access in Deep Ground makes her a higher probability than anyone else but Azul. I would also like to take the time to mention some looser connections. Sonnen makes mention of a sister, one that is seemingly lost. This story directly mirrors another character in the compilation in particular, and that character is Shalua, a character that is also seeking out her sister, as she was taken at a young age by Shinra to Deep Ground. This sister ends up being Shulk. So perhaps, this story is being used to further connect Sonnen to...
Holy shit, you see what I mean? See what I mean? How this dude Sleep Easy go in? Where we at on that video, by the way? 2 hours 5 minutes into that video, the man go in. There's still another hour left of it. And how long we been streaming? All right, almost going on 2 hours, so minute 48, and I'm done with this one. And just like I said, so it's just under 2 hours, and usually these things take just over 2 hours. But I already had the pencil drawing done, so it makes sense. And yeah, man, I love how this one came out. Again, just another dope one. I'm so glad I went and bought those. I thought I was gonna have to buy a whole new pack of markers, but like I said, the dark markers are all fine. It's just the lighter colors, 6 of them in particular that I went and bought. And yeah, now that I have those, I'm like super confident to just like go at it and not worry about, you know what I mean, like how I was kind of noticing it, I think, on this one, and then on here, I really noticed it because I was like, man, this skin's really not coming out. And yeah, so I started applying it here. So, so yeah, man, already seeing some good. Yeah, I just dig it. Either way, that video I've been listening to, or you've been listening to, is by Sleep Easy, spelled Sleep Easy I, all one word. On YouTube, he has a bunch of dope Final Fantasy VII remake videos. Um, yeah, definitely go check those out, man. Cause I mean, if you're into it that much, you see how this guy goes in. So he goes in, man. And and yeah, other than that, besides that, you know, I'm G Mr. Drew, and that's at G Mr. Drew on all social media. You can follow, like, and subscribe. Links are in bio, along with my website, gmrdrew.art. Go check it out. You can see a whole bunch of work that I've done over time, digital, traditional, big, small, everything. And yeah, man, I want to say that's it. That's gonna be it for this video, man. So I want to thank anyone and everyone who's watched this. You've been watching the Andrew Glowczewski Experience, episode 185, working on character concept art. And these are all references that I had already created myself in previous videos by photo bashing a bunch of things together. And now I'm just executing them and trying to, solidify the look of every single one of them to an individual character, which I believe I am accomplishing here. Uh, yeah, so far so good, man. We're gonna keep going. I'll be back tomorrow to do another stream. Hopefully, finish one from beginning to end. And yeah, man, can't wait to see what that one's gonna be and how that's gonna look. So again, want to thank you all for watching, and I'll be back. Peace.